Eleanor Davis disappeared from the heart of Tokyo's Asakusa district, just like a shadow slipping through a crowd. Her family, her friends, the police, everyone searched. But after 2 years of dead ends, they were forced to accept the unthinkable. Eleanor was gone. That was until 5 years later, when Eleanor stepped back into the world with no memory of what happened. She couldn't remember where she had been, who took her, or why she was left to wander the streets of Tokyo. But as the investigation unfolds, a chilling discovery is made. Eleanor wasn't just a victim, she was a part of something far darker. And someone in her life may have been pulling the strings all along. It was October 13th, 1997. That started like any other in the bustling heart of Tokyo. The Asakusa district was alive with energy, packed with tourists snapping photos, street vendors calling out their wares, and the scent of fresh takoyaki drifting through the air. Among the thousands of people weaving through the crowded market that day was a 23-year-old woman named Eleanor Davis, a bright, adventurous soul from Seattle who had dreamed of visiting Japan her entire life. Eleanor had saved for 2 years to make this trip happen. She'd carefully planned every detail, from the temples she wanted to visit to the authentic ramen shops she'd read about online. This was her first solo international trip, and she was determined to make every moment count. Her camera was practically glued to her hand as she documented everything: the vibrant red torii gates, the delicate crafts at the market stalls, the way the afternoon light hit the ancient temple roofs. Her mother, Margaret Davis, had been nervous about Eleanor traveling alone to a foreign country. But Eleanor had reassured her, promising to call every single day and to always stay in crowded, safe areas. And she had kept that promise until that afternoon in Asakusa. At approximately 2:47 p.m., Eleanor was standing near a busy intersection of market stalls, her camera raised to capture a photo of colorful paper lanterns swaying in the breeze. Witnesses later reported seeing her there, smiling, completely absorbed in framing the perfect shot. And then in the time it takes to blink, she was gone. No scream, no struggle, no commotion whatsoever. One moment, Eleanor Davis was there, a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The next moment, the space where she'd been standing was empty, filled only by the endless stream of shoppers who had no idea that someone had just vanished into thin air. It wasn't until nearly 2 hours later that anyone even realized she was missing. Eleanor had planned to meet up with 2 other travelers she'd befriended at her hostel, a couple from Australia, who were supposed to join her for dinner. When she didn't show up at their agreed meeting spot and didn't answer her phone, they assumed she'd simply lost track of time or gotten caught up exploring. Tokyo was overwhelming like that, especially for first-time visitors. But as the hours stretched on and Eleanor still didn't appear, didn't call, didn't respond to any messages, a cold sense of dread began to settle over her new friends. By nightfall, they contacted the hostel. By midnight, they'd filed a missing person report with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. And that's when Margaret Davis received the phone call that would shatter her world into a million pieces. Imagine getting that call: your daughter, your only child, the person you love more than life itself, has disappeared in a foreign country thousands of miles away. Margaret couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The words coming through the phone didn't make sense. Eleanor was careful. Eleanor was smart. Eleanor had promised to stay safe. This couldn't be happening. But it was happening, and what came next would become one of the most baffling missing persons cases in Tokyo's history. A mystery so strange that even today, more than 2 decades later, people still debate what really happened to Eleanor Davis during those 5 lost years. Because here's the thing, here's what makes this case so uniquely disturbing. Eleanor Davis didn't stay missing forever. 5 years after she vanished without a trace, she was found. But the woman who was discovered wandering the streets near Shibuya Crossing in 2003 couldn't remember a single thing about where she'd been or what had happened to her. 5 entire years gone from her memory, as if they'd never existed at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning, to those first desperate hours when Eleanor's disappearance was still fresh, when there was still hope that this was all just a misunderstanding, that she'd turn up any minute with a reasonable explanation. Let's go back to when everyone still believed they could find her. The initial search for Eleanor Davis was immediate and extensive. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police took the case seriously from the start, which wasn't always the case with missing adult tourists. But something about Eleanor's disappearance felt wrong from the very beginning. The circumstances were too strange, too clean. She hadn't checked out of her hostel. All her belongings were still there, her passport, her extra clothes, her journal where she'd been documenting every detail of her trip. The only things missing were Eleanor herself, her camera, and the small crossbody bag she'd been carrying that day. The Australian couple who'd reported her missing provided police with the last known location, that busy intersection in the Asakusa market. Detectives immediately canvassed the area, interviewing dozens of vendors and shopkeepers who worked there every day. And here's where things get even stranger. Several people remembered seeing Eleanor. A vendor selling traditional fans recalled her because she'd spent almost 10 minutes carefully selecting one as a gift for her mother. The woman running a takoyaki stand remembered Eleanor because she'd been so polite, attempting to speak Japanese even though her pronunciation was rough. A street photographer even had a picture of Eleanor in the background of one of his shots, taken around 2:30 p.m., just minutes before she disappeared. But no one, not a single person, could remember seeing her leave. No one saw her walk away. No one saw her get into a vehicle. No one witnessed any kind of altercation or disturbance. It was as if Eleanor Davis had simply ceased to exist in that moment, evaporating into the Tokyo air like morning mist. The police organized search parties that combed through every corner of Asakusa. They checked security camera footage from nearby businesses, but this was 1997 surveillance technology wasn't what it is today. The few cameras that existed in the area had poor resolution and limited coverage. They could see crowds of people moving through the market, but picking out one individual, tracking one person's movements through that sea of humanity, was nearly impossible. Margaret Davis arrived in Tokyo 3 days after Eleanor's disappearance. The moment she stepped off that plane, she knew she was entering a nightmare from which she might never wake up. The language barrier was overwhelming. The city was massive and unfamiliar. And her daughter, her sweet, careful, responsible daughter, was somewhere out there, possibly hurt, possibly afraid, possibly calling out for help that would never come. Margaret threw herself into the search with a desperation that was painful to witness. She had photos of Eleanor, printed thousands of them, and spent every waking hour distributing them throughout Tokyo. She stood on street corners, showing Eleanor's picture to anyone who would stop and look. She visited every police station, every hospital, every morgue, praying she wouldn't find her daughter, but terrified of never finding her at all. The American embassy got involved. Eleanor's case was featured on local news programs. Tips started coming in, dozens of them, then hundreds. Each one had to be investigated, followed up on, tracked down, and each one led absolutely nowhere. Someone thought they saw Eleanor getting on a train heading toward Yokohama. Another person was certain they'd seen her in Shinjuku 3 days after she'd disappeared. A shopkeeper in Ikebukuro claimed a young American woman matching Eleanor's description had come into his store acting strangely, disoriented, unable to communicate. Every single lead was pursued. Every single lead turned into a dead end. Weeks turned into months, and the awful truth began to settle over everyone involved. Eleanor Davis might never be found. The investigation wasn't closed, not officially, but the active search efforts began to wind down. There were other cases, other missing people, other emergencies that demanded the police department's attention. Margaret refused to give up. She stayed in Tokyo for 3 full months, spending her life savings on extended hotel stays and private investigators. But eventually, even she had to face reality. She had a job back home that she'd already taken too much time away from. Bills were piling up, and staying in Tokyo wasn't bringing her any closer to finding Eleanor. With a heart that felt like it had been ripped from her chest, Margaret finally returned to Seattle in January of 1998. But she made a promise to herself and to her missing daughter she would never stop searching. Never stop hoping. Never stop believing that somehow, some way, Eleanor would come home. What Margaret didn't know, what no one could have possibly known, was that it would take 5 more years for that promise to be kept in the strangest, most inexplicable way imaginable. Time has a cruel way of moving forward, whether we want it to or not. The world doesn't stop spinning just because your world has stopped making sense. And as 1998 turned into 1999, then 2000, then 2001, Eleanor Davis's case gradually faded from the public consciousness. It's not that people didn't care, it's that the human mind can only hold so much tragedy, so much uncertainty, before it has to move on to survive. New missing persons cases emerged. New tragedies captured the news cycle, and slowly, painfully, Eleanor became just another name in a file, just another unsolved case gathering dust in a police department archive. But for Margaret Davis, every single day was exactly the same. She woke up not knowing where her daughter was. She went to bed not knowing if Eleanor was alive or dead, safe or suffering. That kind of not knowing is its own special kind of torture. It doesn't let you grieve, doesn't let you heal, doesn't let you move forward or backward. You're just stuck, frozen in that moment, when everything fell apart, unable to do anything but wait. Margaret turned Eleanor's bedroom into a shrine of sorts. Everything remained exactly as Eleanor had left it. Textbooks from her last semester of college still stacked on the desk, concert ticket stubs pinned to a corkboard, photos of friends taped to the mirror. Margaret couldn't bring herself to change anything. Moving Eleanor's things felt too much like admitting she was never coming back. The anniversaries were the hardest: Eleanor's birthday, the anniversary of her disappearance, Christmas. All the days that used to be filled with joy, now marked only by absence and pain. Margaret would sit in Eleanor's room on those days, holding her daughter's favorite sweater, breathing in a scent that had long since faded, talking to someone who couldn't hear her. Friends and family tried to help, of course. They encouraged Margaret to see a therapist, to join a support group for families of missing persons, to slowly start rebuilding some kind of life. And Margaret did try for a while. She went to a few group meetings, sat in circles with other people who understood this specific flavor of grief, who knew what it meant to be trapped in limbo. But it didn't help, not really. Because the other families at those meetings, the other parents of missing children, at least they had updates sometimes. A body found, bringing terrible closure, but closure nonetheless. Or their loved one had struggled with addiction, with mental illness, giving them a framework to understand the disappearance. Or there'd been a fight, a reason for someone to run away, a trail however faint to follow. Eleanor's case had none of that. No explanation, no context, no reason whatsoever for a happy, healthy, excited young woman to simply vanish in the middle of a crowded market in broad daylight. In 2000, Margaret hired another private investigator, her fourth since Eleanor's disappearance. This one came highly recommended, had connections in Japan, claimed he'd solved several cold cases. Margaret scraped together money she didn't really have to pay his retainer, clinging to the desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. The investigator spent 3 months working the case. He traveled to Tokyo, re-interviewed witnesses, dug through police reports with fresh eyes. And in the end, he told Margaret the same thing all the others had. There was simply nothing to find. No evidence of foul play, but no evidence of anything at all. Eleanor Davis had disappeared so completely, so thoroughly, that it was as if she'd never existed in the first place. That report nearly broke Margaret completely. She fell into a deep depression, stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining her house, stopped doing much of anything except existing in a fog of grief and confusion. Her sister eventually moved in with her for a few months, just to make sure Margaret didn't completely fall apart. And then something changed. It was small at first, barely noticeable. But gradually, Margaret began to realize that if she didn't find a way to keep living, to keep functioning, then Eleanor's disappearance would have claimed 2 victims instead of 1. Her daughter wouldn't want that. Eleanor had been so full of life, so determined to embrace every moment. Letting that light be extinguished completely felt like a betrayal of everything Eleanor had been. So Margaret made a choice. She would keep living, not moving on, never moving on, but living. She went back to work. She reconnected with friends she'd been avoiding. She found small ways to honor Eleanor's memory, volunteering at a local organization that helped families of missing persons, channeling her pain into something that might help someone else. She never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somehow, against all odds, she might see her daughter again. But she also accepted that hope alone wasn't enough to survive on. She had to find a way to exist in the uncertainty, to build some kind of life in the space between knowing and not knowing. By 2002, 5 years had passed since Eleanor's disappearance. 5 years of waiting, wondering, hoping, grieving. Margaret had learned to function. learned to smile at the right moments, learned to answer when people asked how she was doing without completely falling apart. But inside, she was still that mother standing in a Tokyo police station, clutching a photo of her missing daughter, begging anyone who would listen to help her find her baby girl. Inside, she was still waiting for Eleanor to come home. And then impossibly, inexplicably, Eleanor did. March 13th, 2003. A Friday afternoon in Tokyo, overcast and cool. The crowds at Shibuya Crossing were doing what they did every day, hundreds of people moving in choreographed chaos when the lights changed, flooding across the intersection from all directions, somehow never colliding, always finding their path through the sea of humanity. A police officer named Kenji Tanaka was on routine patrol in the area when he noticed something unusual. A young woman, Western in appearance, was standing in the middle of the crossing even after the light had changed. Cars were honking. People were swerving around her. She seemed completely disoriented, turning in slow circles, her eyes wide and unfocused. Officer Tanaka approached her carefully, concerned she might be having some kind of medical episode. When he got close enough to speak to her, he realized she was mumbling something in English, the same phrase over and over, though he couldn't quite make out the words. He gently guided her to the sidewalk, out of the traffic, and that's when he got his first good look at her face. She was thin, too thin, really, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. Her clothes were worn but clean, a simple shirt and jeans that looked like they'd been worn for days. Her hair was longer than it appeared she was used to, hanging in her face like she'd forgotten it was there. Officer Tanaka tried speaking to her in the limited English he knew. Did she need help? Was she lost? Where was she trying to go? The woman looked at him, and for a moment her eyes seemed to focus. And then she said something that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. She said, "I don't know. I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here." Officer Tanaka, thinking she might be a tourist who'd gotten separated from her group or perhaps had too much to drink, asked if she had identification. The woman patted her pockets, her movements uncertain and clumsy, and eventually pulled out a small, worn wallet. Inside was an American driver's license. Officer Tanaka looked at it, then looked at the woman in front of him. The photo on the license showed a younger version of the same face, brighter, healthier, smiling at the camera with confidence and joy. The name on the license was Eleanor Davis. The issue date was 1996. Now, Officer Tanaka had been with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police for almost a decade. He'd seen a lot of strange things, encountered a lot of unusual situations, but something about this felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He radioed for backup and asked the woman if she could come with him to the station just to sort things out. Eleanor, because it was Eleanor. Impossibly, inexplicably, Eleanor didn't resist. She seemed almost relieved to have someone telling her what to do, where to go. She followed Officer Tanaka docilely, climbing into the back of the patrol car without question, still looking around at Tokyo like she'd never seen it before. At the station, they sat her down in a quiet room and began asking basic questions. What's your name? Where are you from? How did you end up in Tokyo? Is there someone we can call for you? And Eleanor, this woman who'd been missing for 5 years, who'd been searched for across an entire city, who'd caused her mother unimaginable anguish, looked at them with eyes that held nothing but confusion and fear. "My name is Eleanor Davis," she said slowly, like she was testing the words in her mouth. "I'm from Seattle. I came to Tokyo for vacation." "When did you arrive in Tokyo?" they asked. Eleanor's brow furrowed. She was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to remember. "I'm not sure. Recently, I think. I was taking pictures at a market. There were lanterns. And then?" She trailed off, her expression growing more distressed. "And then what?" the officers prompted gently. "I don't know," Eleanor's voice cracked. "I don't remember. I was at the market, and then I was just here, at that intersection. I don't know what happened in between." The officers exchanged glances. This was starting to feel like more than just a disoriented tourist. They asked if they could check her name in the system, and Eleanor nodded, seeming almost hopeful that the computer would have answers she didn't. When her name pulled up a missing person report from October 1997, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. The officer reading the screen went very still. He read it again, certain he must be misunderstanding something. Then he called over his supervisor. And then another detective. And within minutes, the quiet interview room was filled with people, all staring at this thin, confused woman who'd apparently been missing for over 5 years. "Miss Davis," the lead detective said carefully, "according to our records, you were reported missing on October 13th, 1997. That was over 5 years ago. Do you remember anything from the past 5 years?" Eleanor stared at him. The color drained from her face. "5 years?" she whispered. "That's not possible. That's not. I was just in Asakusa. It was just today. How can it be 5 years?" They showed her a newspaper with the current date. They showed her a calendar. They tried to gently, carefully explain that somehow, impossibly, 5 years of her life had passed. And Eleanor Davis, who'd been missing since 1997, who'd been searched for across Tokyo and mourned by her devastated mother, looked at the evidence in front of her and started to cry. Because she didn't remember any of it. Not one single day of those 5 years. It was all just gone. The news spread fast. Within hours, the American embassy had been contacted. Within a day, Margaret Davis received a phone call that she'd been simultaneously praying for and dreading for 5 long years. "Mrs. Davis? This is the American embassy in Tokyo. We're calling about your daughter, Eleanor. She's been found. She's alive." Margaret dropped the phone. Her knees gave out. She collapsed to her kitchen floor, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she'd just heard. Eleanor was alive. After 5 years of not knowing, of imagining every terrible possibility, of mourning a daughter who might not have been dead, Eleanor was alive. The details came in fragments over the next several hours, through multiple phone calls with embassy officials and Japanese police. Eleanor had been found in Shibuya. She appeared to be physically okay, just malnourished and disoriented. She was being taken to a hospital for a full medical evaluation. And this was the part that made Margaret's head spin. Eleanor claimed to have no memory of the past 5 years. Margaret was on a plane to Tokyo within 24 hours, moving through airport security and customs in a daze. Her mind couldn't quite reconcile what she'd been told. Eleanor was alive. Eleanor was found. Eleanor didn't remember. What did that mean? How was that possible? Had she been held captive somewhere, subjected to something so traumatic that her mind had blocked it all out? Had she been drugged, brainwashed, manipulated? The questions spiraled through Margaret's head like a tornado, each one more frightening than the last. When Margaret finally walked into that hospital room in Tokyo and saw her daughter for the first time in 5 years, she almost didn't recognize her. This wasn't the bright, confident, healthy young woman who'd left for vacation in 1997. This was someone who'd been hollowed out, worn down, aged beyond her years despite only being 28 years old. But it was Eleanor. It was her daughter. It was her baby. Margaret crossed the room and pulled Eleanor into her arms, and both women broke down completely. They held each other and cried, 5 years of anguish and confusion and fear pouring out in wrenching sobs that echoed through the hospital room. "I'm sorry," Eleanor kept saying through her tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know what happened. I don't know where I was. I'm so sorry." And Margaret, who'd imagined this moment 10,000 times but never like this, could only hold her daughter tighter and repeat over and over, "You're alive. You're here. That's all that matters. You're here." But even in that moment of overwhelming relief and joy, there was a shadow of dread creeping in. Because the doctors had already warned Margaret about what they'd found, or rather, what they hadn't found. Eleanor had been subjected to a battery of medical tests. Physically, she was relatively healthy aside from signs of malnutrition and dehydration. There were no major injuries, no signs of physical abuse or assault. That was the good news. The concerning news was everything else. Eleanor couldn't remember anything from the past 5 years. Not fragments, not dreams, not fleeting impressions, nothing. According to the neurological evaluation, she was suffering from severe retrograde amnesia affecting only a specific time period. Her long-term memories from before October 1997 were intact. She remembered her childhood, her education, her friends, her mother. She remembered planning her trip to Japan, getting on the plane, arriving in Tokyo, exploring the city. But after that day in the Asakusa market, There was nothing but darkness. 5 years had simply been erased from her mind as if they'd never existed at all. Even more disturbing, Eleanor also had some degree of anterograde amnesia difficulty forming new memories. The doctors couldn't say whether this was temporary or permanent, whether it was caused by psychological trauma or if there might be some other explanation. They ran every test they could think of. Brain scans showed no obvious physical damage, no tumors, no signs of stroke or injury. Toxicology screens came back clean, no drugs in her system, nothing that would explain the memory loss. Blood work was normal. Everything that they could measure, everything they could test, came back saying that Eleanor Davis should be perfectly fine. Except she wasn't fine. She was a woman with 5 missing years, and no explanation for where they'd gone or what had happened to her during that time. The psychiatrists who evaluated Eleanor were baffled. Retrograde amnesia, affecting such a specific, lengthy period, was extremely rare. Usually, memory loss either affected recent events and gradually recovered, or it was caused by severe physical trauma to the brain that would show up on scans. Eleanor's case fit none of the typical patterns. It was as if someone had carefully, surgically removed 5 years of her life from her memory, leaving everything else perfectly intact. The police investigators wanted answers as much as Margaret did. Where had Eleanor been for 5 years? How had she survived? Who had she been with? What had happened to her? But Eleanor couldn't tell them. Every time they asked, she became more distressed, more agitated. The frustration of not being able to remember was eating away at her. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, clearly trying desperately to pull something, anything, from the blank space where her memories should have been. Sometimes, she would get fragments, flashes of images that felt more like dreams than memories. A darkened room, the sound of traffic outside a window, the smell of food cooking. A voice speaking Japanese, though she couldn't remember what it said. But these fragments were disconnected, nonsensical. They didn't form any kind of narrative or explanation. They were just pieces of a puzzle scattered across the floor, with no picture to reference, no way to know what they were supposed to form. One of the investigating detectives had a theory. He'd read about cases of people who'd experienced severe trauma and developed dissociative amnesia as a protection mechanism. The mind, overwhelmed by something too terrible to process, simply shuts down and walls off the traumatic memories to preserve the person's sanity. If that was what had happened to Eleanor, it meant that those 5 missing years might contain something so horrific that her brain had chosen to forget entirely rather than let her remember. The thought made Margaret feel physically ill. What could her daughter have endured that was so terrible her mind had erased it completely? Another detective proposed a different theory, that Eleanor had been held by someone who'd systematically manipulated her, possibly drugged her, possibly subjected her to some kind of brainwashing or psychological conditioning. There were documented cases of kidnapping victims who'd been held for years, their captors using various methods to break down their sense of identity and memory. But if that was true, where was Eleanor's captor now? Why had they released her? And why couldn't Eleanor remember any of it? A third theory, suggested quietly by one of the psychiatrists, was that perhaps Eleanor had suffered some kind of psychotic break. Maybe she'd developed a severe mental illness triggered by something that happened in Tokyo. Maybe she'd spent the past 5 years in a dissociative fugue state, wandering, possibly homeless, possibly in and out of institutions. Her mind protecting her from the reality of her situation by simply shutting down. Every theory was disturbing in its own way, and none of them could be proven or disproven without Eleanor's memories, which remained frustratingly, inexplicably absent. Margaret stayed in Tokyo for 3 weeks, barely leaving Eleanor's side. The hospital released Eleanor after 2 weeks of observation and testing, and mother and daughter moved into a hotel room together. Margaret watched her daughter with a mixture of joy and heartbreak, grateful to have her back but devastated by how much Eleanor had changed. This woman who shared her daughter's face wasn't quite the Eleanor she remembered. This Eleanor was hesitant, uncertain, easily overwhelmed. Loud noises made her flinch. Crowds made her anxious. She clung to Margaret like a frightened child, afraid to be alone, afraid that if she closed her eyes, she might wake up in another 5 years with more missing time. The plan was to return to Seattle together once Eleanor was cleared to travel. The doctors wanted to continue monitoring her condition, wanted to see if being back in familiar surroundings might trigger any memories to surface. But before they could leave Tokyo, something happened that would crack open the mystery just a little bit more, though it would raise more questions than it answered. It started with a phone call to the police department. A man who'd seen news coverage of Eleanor's return because, yes, the story had made the news. A missing tourist found after 5 years with no memory drawing significant media attention claimed he might have information. The man's name was Hiroshi Nakamura, and he owned a small restaurant in the Nakano neighborhood of Tokyo. He told police that he was almost certain he'd seen Eleanor before. Not recently, but about 3 years ago, maybe in 2000. The detectives were skeptical but followed up. They brought Eleanor and Margaret to meet with Mr. Nakamura to see if anything about him or his restaurant might trigger a memory. The moment Eleanor walked into the small, modest restaurant, she stopped. Her hand went to her head. Margaret watched her daughter's face go pale, watched her eyes go wide. "I've been here," Eleanor whispered. "I don't remember it, but I know I've been here." Mr. Nakamura looked at her carefully, then nodded. "Yes, I thought so when I saw your picture on the news. You used to come here. Not often, maybe once every few weeks. Always alone. Always very quiet." Eleanor sank into one of the chairs, trembling. "I don't remember," she said, but there was something in her voice, a note of recognition, of something just beyond reach. The detective leading the investigation asked Mr. Nakamura if he could describe these visits in more detail. When had they started? When had they stopped? Did Eleanor ever speak to him? Was she with anyone? Mr. Nakamura pulled out a worn calendar where he kept track of regular customers and special reservations. He flipped back through the pages, through years of notations and scribbled reminders, until he found what he was looking for. According to his records, Eleanor had first appeared at his restaurant in August of 1998, nearly a year after she'd disappeared. She'd been a regular customer, though irregular in her visits, until about January of 2001. After that, he never saw her again. "She always ordered the same thing," Mr. Nakamura explained. "Miso soup and rice. Very simple. She would sit in the corner booth, always the same seat, and she would eat very slowly. Sometimes she would stare out the window for an hour or more." "Did she speak to you?" the detective asked. "Did she seem distressed? Was she with anyone?" Mr. Nakamura shook his head. "She spoke very little. Her Japanese was basic but understandable. She never seemed distressed exactly, but she was somewhere else. Like her mind was always far away. And no, I never saw her with anyone. She always came alone and left alone." Margaret felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Her daughter had been here, in this restaurant, regularly for more than 2 years. Alive, free, able to walk around Tokyo and order food and exist in the world. And yet she'd never called, never reached out, never tried to come home. Why? The detective asked the question that was burning in everyone's mind. "Mr. Nakamura, in all those visits, did Eleanor ever seem like she was being held against her will? Was there any indication that she was afraid or trying to escape from something?" Mr. Nakamura considered this carefully. "No," he finally said. "She seemed sad, I think. Lost, maybe, but not afraid. Not like someone who was running or hiding." They showed Eleanor photos that Mr. Nakamura had taken of his restaurant over the years, photos that happened to have customers in the background. In 3 of them, there she was, a thin figure sitting alone in the corner booth, staring at nothing. Eleanor looked at these photos of herself, photos from a time she couldn't remember, and started to cry. "Why didn't I call my mom?" she asked, her voice breaking. "If I was free, if I was able to go to restaurants and order food, why didn't I call her? Why didn't I try to go home?" No one had an answer for her. The discovery of Mr. Nakamura's testimony opened up new avenues of investigation. The police began canvassing the Nakano neighborhood, showing Eleanor's photo to other business owners, asking if anyone else recognized her. And they found more. A convenience store clerk remembered her buying basic supplies, soap, toothpaste, simple foods. The owner of a used bookstore recalled her coming in occasionally, though she never bought anything, just browsed quietly for hours. A woman who ran a laundromat remembered seeing her there, always washing the same few articles of clothing, always alone. These witnesses painted a picture of someone who'd been living in the area, functioning at a basic level, but not really living at all. More like existing. going through the motions of survival without any apparent purpose or direction. But where had she been staying? The police combed through rental records, hotel registries, hostel logs. They found nothing. No Eleanor Davis. No record of anyone matching her description renting a room or staying anywhere officially. One detective theorized that she might have been staying in one of the cybercafes that were popular in Tokyo, places where you could rent a small booth by the hour or overnight. No questions asked, no documentation required. Many of them operated 24 hours and had become unofficial shelters for people who had nowhere else to go. They checked every cybercafe in the Nakano area and the surrounding neighborhoods. Some had records going back far enough to potentially include Eleanor's missing years. But none of them kept customer information beyond basic logs, and those logs were long gone. They were finding breadcrumbs, tiny traces that Eleanor had existed during those missing years, but nothing that explained where she'd really been or what had happened to her. It was like trying to reconstruct a story from random words scattered across a field. You could see that something had been written, but you couldn't read what it said. Eleanor herself became more and more distressed as these discoveries emerged. Each piece of evidence that showed her living some kind of half-life in Tokyo was another reminder of time she couldn't access, experiences she couldn't recall. The psychiatrist warned that pushing too hard, trying to force memories to surface, could be counterproductive or even harmful. The brain had blocked these memories for a reason, they said. Trying to forcefully break down those barriers might cause more damage than good. But Eleanor wanted to remember. She needed to understand what had happened to her, why she'd lost 5 years of her life, why she'd been walking around Tokyo like a ghost instead of coming home to her mother. They tried hypnotherapy. Eleanor was a willing participant, desperate for anything that might unlock the blank spaces in her mind. The hypnotherapist worked with her for several sessions, guiding her into deep relaxation, gently suggesting that her subconscious mind might allow some memories to surface. And something did surface, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Under hypnosis, Eleanor began to speak in Japanese. This was already strange because Eleanor's Japanese in her conscious state was extremely basic, limited to a few tourist phrases and simple words. But under hypnosis, she spoke in longer sentences, more complex structures, though her accent was still clearly foreign. The interpreter who was present translated what Eleanor was saying. She was describing a room small, with a single window that looked out onto a street. She could hear the train going by regularly. There was a calendar on the wall, but she couldn't read the date. Someone brought her food every day. She was supposed to wait. Wait for what? The hypnotherapist asked gently. Eleanor's face, peaceful a moment before, suddenly contorted in distress. I don't know, she said in English, breaking out of the Japanese. I don't know. I was waiting, but I don't know why. The session had to be ended there, as Eleanor became too agitated to continue safely. When she was brought out of the hypnotic state, she remembered none of what she'd said. The lead detective on the case, a man named Yamamoto who'd been working missing persons cases for 15 years, had a new theory. He believed that Eleanor had been held somewhere, possibly that small room she'd described, under hypnosis for some period of time after her initial disappearance. During that time, she'd been isolated, possibly drugged or psychologically manipulated, until she was released or escaped. But without her memory, without being able to identify the location she'd described or the person who'd allegedly brought her food, they had no way to investigate further. The description was too vague. A small room with a window and a train nearby could describe thousands of locations in Tokyo. Detective Yamamoto began looking at unsolved missing persons cases from around the same time period, wondering if there might be a pattern, other victims who'd experienced something similar. He found several cases of foreign tourists who'd gone missing in Tokyo over the years, but none of them had turned up alive, and none of the circumstances quite matched Eleanor's case. There was one case, though, that gave him pause. In 1996, a German tourist had gone missing in Tokyo, and was found 6 months later, disoriented and unable to remember where he'd been. The case had been written off as a mental health crisis. The man was diagnosed with a dissociative disorder and returned to Germany. Detective Yamamoto wondered now if there might have been more to that case than anyone had realized. But the German tourist had died in 2000, and whatever he might have known about his missing time had died with him. The investigation was hitting wall after wall. Every lead seemed promising at first, then dissolved into nothing. They had fragments and theories and unanswered questions, but no solid evidence, no clear narrative, no satisfying explanation for what had happened to Eleanor Davis. After 4 weeks in Tokyo, the doctors cleared Eleanor to travel back to the United States. There was nothing more they could do for her in Japan, and being in familiar surroundings might actually help her recovery more than staying in the city where she'd lost so much time. Margaret and Eleanor boarded a plane for Seattle, leaving behind a team of investigators who promised to continue working the case, though everyone involved knew that without Eleanor's memories, they were unlikely to ever find real answers. On the flight home, Eleanor stared out the window, watching Tokyo disappear beneath the clouds. Somewhere down there was the truth about her missing years. Somewhere in that vast city were the answers to questions that haunted her every waking moment. But those answers remained locked away, hidden behind walls her mind had built, and she had no idea if she would ever be able to break through them. Returning to Seattle was supposed to be a relief. Home was supposed to feel safe, familiar, comforting. But for Eleanor, walking back into her childhood home was like stepping into a museum of a life she'd lived in another lifetime. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her bedroom, preserved like a shrine for 5 years, looked like it was waiting for a 23-year-old college student to come home, not a 28-year-old woman who'd lost a chunk of her life to circumstances she couldn't explain. Margaret had prepared herself for the fact that recovery was going to be a long process. The doctors in Tokyo had warned her that Eleanor's amnesia might be permanent, that the memories might never return. They'd also cautioned that even if Eleanor's physical health improved, the psychological impact of her experience, whatever that experience had been, would likely take years to process. What Margaret wasn't prepared for was how much Eleanor had changed in ways that had nothing to do with the missing memories. The Eleanor who'd left for Tokyo in 1997 had been confident, social, adventurous. She'd had a wide circle of friends, plans for graduate school, a whole life spread out in front of her like an open road. The Eleanor who came back in 2003 was quiet, withdrawn, easily overwhelmed by stimuli that used to barely register. The sound of traffic made her anxious. Crowded places triggered panic attacks. She couldn't sleep without a light on. She startled at unexpected noises. It was like living with someone who'd been to war, Margaret thought. Someone who'd experienced trauma so profound that it had fundamentally altered who they were, even if they couldn't consciously remember what that trauma had been. Eleanor started seeing a psychiatrist in Seattle, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. Dr. Chen approached Eleanor's case with patience and compassion, never pushing, always letting Eleanor set the pace of their sessions. In their early meetings, they didn't even talk about the missing 5 years. They talked about what Eleanor could remember: her childhood, her adolescence, her college years. They talked about what her life had been like before Tokyo, helping Eleanor reconnect with the person she'd been. Dr. Chen explained that identity wasn't just about memories. It was about values, preferences, skills, all the things that made a person who they were. Even if Eleanor couldn't remember 5 years of her life, she was still fundamentally herself, still the daughter Margaret had raised, still the person who loved art and music and long walks in the rain. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to rebuild some sense of self. She started painting again, something she'd loved in college but hadn't touched in years. The act of creating something with her hands was soothing, meditative. It gave her a way to express emotions she couldn't put into words. Her paintings were abstract, dark, full of shadows and fragmented shapes. Dr. Chen encouraged her to paint without thinking about what it meant, to just let her unconscious mind express itself through color and form. One of these paintings caught Margaret's attention. It showed a figure, gender and age unclear, standing in a small room. Through a window, you could see part of a city street, but it was distorted, dreamlike. The figure's face was turned away, their posture suggesting waiting, anticipation. "Eleanor," Margaret asked gently, "is this about the room you described under hypnosis in Tokyo?" Eleanor looked at the painting like she was seeing it for the first time. "I don't know," she said slowly. "Maybe? I wasn't thinking about anything specific when I painted it, it just came out this way." Dr. Chen had a theory that Eleanor's missing memories might be trying to surface through her art. The unconscious mind often found ways to express what the conscious mind couldn't access. She encouraged Eleanor to continue painting, to see if other images might emerge. And they did. Painting after painting, Eleanor created scenes that felt like fragments of a dream or memories glimpsed through fog. A street corner that might have been in Tokyo, a bowl of soup on a table, a calendar with dates marked in red, a pair of shoes by a door. None of these images meant anything specific to Eleanor in her conscious state, but Dr. Chen carefully documented each one, wondering if they might eventually form a pattern or narrative that could help unlock Eleanor's memories. Margaret watched this process with a mixture of hope and fear. Part of her desperately wanted Eleanor to remember what had happened, to finally have answers to all the questions that had haunted them both. But another part of her wondered if maybe Eleanor's mind had blocked these memories for a good reason. What if remembering would only bring more pain? Eleanor's friends from before her disappearance tried to reconnect with her, but it was difficult. 5 years was a long time. People had moved on with their lives, graduated, gotten jobs, married, had children, and Eleanor couldn't relate to any of it. She'd missed all of it, lost not just 5 years of her own life but 5 years of everyone else's lives too. There was also the elephant in the room that no one knew how to address what exactly had happened to Eleanor. Her friends would ask, tentatively, carefully, and Eleanor would have to explain that she didn't know, she couldn't remember. And the conversation would stall out, everyone feeling awkward and uncertain about what to say next. It was easier, in many ways, for Eleanor to avoid those old connections, to start fresh with people who didn't know her history, who wouldn't look at her with that mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She got a part-time job at a local art supply store. The work was simple, unchallenging, but it gave her a routine and got her out of the house. Her co-workers knew she'd been through something difficult but didn't pry for details, and Eleanor was grateful for that small mercy. Months passed, then a year. Eleanor's physical health improved. She gained back the weight she'd lost. The dark circles under her eyes faded. She looked more like the young woman she was supposed to be. But the memories stayed locked away, no matter how many therapy sessions she attended or how many paintings she created. Detective Yamamoto from Tokyo maintained occasional contact, emailing Margaret whenever there was a potential development in the case. But the developments were always small, ultimately leading nowhere. Another witness who thought they might have seen Eleanor. Another business that might have records. Another theory that fell apart under scrutiny. The Japanese police had done everything they could, but without Eleanor's memories or any concrete evidence of a crime, there was only so far the investigation could go. Eventually, Detective Yamamoto had to admit that unless something dramatically changed, they'd likely never know the full truth of what happened to Eleanor Davis during those 5 missing years. Eleanor tried to make peace with that. Dr. Chen worked with her on acceptance, on learning to live with uncertainty, on building a life in the present rather than being trapped by a past she couldn't access. But late at night, when Eleanor was alone in her room, the question still haunted her. Where had she been? What had she done? Why couldn't she remember? And the question that perhaps haunted her most of all, who had she been during those 5 years? Was that person still inside her somewhere, hidden behind the walls of amnesia? Or had that version of Eleanor been lost forever, leaving behind only fragments and shadows and paintings of rooms she couldn't quite remember? Then came the breakthrough, small at first. So small it almost went unnoticed. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, almost 18 months after Eleanor's return from Tokyo. Eleanor was at home, helping Margaret prepare dinner. The radio was on in the background, playing music interspersed with news updates. Eleanor wasn't really paying attention to it, focused instead on chopping vegetables for a salad. And then a song started playing. It was a Japanese pop song from the late 1990 seconds, something that had been popular during Eleanor's missing years. The melody was bright, upbeat, the kind of song that would have been playing in shops and cafes all over Tokyo. Eleanor's hands stopped moving. The knife she'd been holding clattered to the cutting board. Her whole body went rigid. Margaret looked up, concerned. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" But Eleanor wasn't there, not really. Her eyes had gone unfocused, distant, and then she started humming along with the song. Not just the melody, but every note, every inflection, like she'd heard it 1,000 times before. When the song ended, Eleanor blinked, coming back to herself. She looked at her mother with wide, confused eyes. "I know that song," she whispered. "I don't remember learning it, but I know every word." It was the first concrete evidence that Eleanor's missing years had left some kind of impression on her, even if she couldn't consciously access the memories. The knowledge was there, hidden somewhere in her brain, emerging through music in a way it couldn't through conscious recall. Dr. Chen was fascinated by this development. She'd heard of cases where music could unlock memories that other stimuli couldn't reach. Music was processed differently in the brain than other types of memory, often surviving even severe neurological damage. She suggested a new approach to therapy, using music from the period of Eleanor's disappearance as a potential trigger for memory recovery. It was worth trying, she said, though she cautioned that it might not work and could potentially be distressing. Eleanor was willing to try anything. They started collecting Japanese music from 1997 to 2003, creating playlists of songs that would have been popular during the years Eleanor was missing. The results were inconsistent but intriguing. Some songs produced no reaction at all, but others triggered something. Eleanor would suddenly know lyrics in Japanese that she couldn't have learned anywhere else. She would have emotional reactions to certain songs, sadness or anxiety or sometimes a strange sense of comfort, though she couldn't explain why. One song in particular seemed to affect her more deeply than the others. It was a melancholic ballad about waiting for someone who might never return. When it played, Eleanor would become very still, very quiet. Tears would run down her face, though she couldn't say why she was crying. "I've heard this song so many times," she told Dr. Chen during a session. "I can feel that I have, but I don't know where or when or why. It's like the memory is right there, just beyond my reach, and I can't quite grasp it." Dr. Chen wondered if this song might have been playing in the small room Eleanor had described under hypnosis. Maybe she'd listened to it over and over during whatever time she'd spent there, the music becoming associated with whatever emotions she'd been feeling. They tried to build on this small breakthrough. Using the music as a foundation, they attempted another hypnotherapy session, this time playing the songs that seemed to trigger the strongest reactions in Eleanor. Under hypnosis, with the melancholic ballad playing softly in the background, Eleanor began to speak. Her voice was quiet, distant, like she was narrating something from very far away. "I'm in the room," she said. "The small room. I can hear the train outside. The song is playing on a radio. I'm waiting." "What are you waiting for?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "For it to be time," Eleanor replied. "I have to wait until it's time." "Time for what?" Eleanor's brow furrowed. "I don't know. I don't remember. But I know I can't leave yet. It's not time." "Who told you that you can't leave?" A long pause. The song continued playing, its sad melody filling the silence. "I told myself," Eleanor finally said. "I can't leave until something. Until I'm ready. Until it's safe. Until." She trailed off, frustration clear even in her hypnotic state. They continued these sessions over several weeks, each time uncovering small fragments that didn't quite form a coherent picture. Eleanor described the room in more detail: a single bed, a small table, a window with a view of a street, and the train tracks beyond. She described a routine of sorts: waking up, eating simple meals, listening to the radio, waiting. But she couldn't describe who had put her in that room, or why she'd stayed there. She couldn't explain how she'd ended up at the restaurant Mr. Nakamura had recognized her from, or why she'd been wandering around Nakano for years. The most frustrating part was that Eleanor's descriptions made it sound like she hadn't been held against her will, at least not physically. There was no mention of being locked in, no description of captors or threats. It was more like she'd locked herself away, though the reason why remained frustratingly out of reach. Dr. Chen had a new theory, one she shared cautiously with Eleanor and Margaret. She believed that Eleanor might have experienced some kind of psychotic break or severe dissociative episode triggered by something that happened on the day she disappeared in Asakusa. During this episode, she might have created an alternative reality for herself, living in a kind of fugue state where she was disconnected from her true identity and unable to process the need to return home. "It's like your mind decided it needed time to heal from something," Dr. Chen explained. "So it created this space, this room, this waiting period, where you could exist without having to face whatever it was that had overwhelmed you. Your conscious self wasn't aware of any of this. You were essentially on autopilot, going through the motions of survival but not really present." "But what could have happened that was so terrible my mind needed to do that?" Eleanor asked, and the pain in her voice was clear. "What could have been so bad that I had to disappear for 5 years?" Dr. Chen had no answer for that. And without Eleanor's memories, they might never know. The investigation in Tokyo had been quietly continuing in the background, though with limited resources and no new leads. But then, almost 2 years after Eleanor's return, something new emerged. A woman contacted the Tokyo police, saying she'd seen the news stories about Eleanor Davis back when she'd first been found, and something had been nagging at her ever since. She'd finally decided to come forward. The woman's name was Yuki Tanaka, and she'd worked at a small clinic in the Nakano area from 1999 to 2001. She remembered treating a young Western woman who matched Eleanor's description multiple times, actually, for various minor ailments. The clinic had been a cash-only operation that didn't require identification or insurance information. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted medical treatment without documentation, for whatever reason. Detective Yamamoto, still working Eleanor's case when he had time, immediately followed up on this lead. The clinic had closed in 2002, but he managed to track down some of the old records that had been stored in a warehouse. And there, in handwritten notes from 1999 to 2001, were records of treatments given to a patient identified only as ED. The dates aligned perfectly with the time period when Eleanor would have been missing. The notes described treatment for malnutrition, dehydration, anxiety, insomnia. There were multiple visits over the course of 2 years, all paid for in cash, always just treating symptoms without ever addressing underlying causes. Yuki Tanaka, when interviewed, remembered the patient clearly. She was very quiet, Yuki said. She spoke some Japanese but not well. She never told me her full name or where she was staying. I asked once if she needed help, if someone was hurting her, and she just looked at me like she didn't understand the question. Did she seem afraid? Detective Yamamoto asked. Yuki considered this carefully. No, not afraid. Sad, maybe. Lost. Like she was somewhere far away even when she was standing right in front of me. This new evidence confirmed that Eleanor had been living in the Nakano area, unsupervised and apparently free to move around, seeking medical treatment when needed. But it brought them no closer to understanding why she'd been there, or what had caused her to disconnect so completely from her previous life. Detective Yamamoto sent all this new information to Eleanor and her family. Margaret read the reports, with tears streaming down her face. Her daughter had been sick, had needed medical care, and Margaret hadn't been there to help her. Eleanor read the records with a strange sense of detachment. She was reading about herself, about medical visits she'd apparently made, problems she'd apparently had, but none of it felt real. It was like reading a story about a stranger who happened to share her name. I was there, she said to Dr. Chen during their next session. I was alive, walking around Tokyo, going to clinics, eating at restaurants, but I wasn't really there. Some other version of me was living that life, and I don't know who she was or what she was thinking or why she didn't come home. Dr. Chen gently suggested that maybe that other Eleanor, the one who'd lived those missing 5 years, hadn't been capable of coming home. Maybe she'd been so lost, so disconnected, that the very concept of home had become meaningless to her. So, what brought me back? Eleanor asked. If I was that far gone, what changed? Why did I suddenly appear in Shibuya 5 years later? That was the question no one could answer. What had happened in March of 2003 that had somehow broken through Eleanor's fugue state and brought her back to awareness, confused and disoriented, in the middle of a crowded intersection? The most likely theory was that it had been gradual. Perhaps Eleanor's mind had slowly been healing itself over the course of those 5 years. Maybe by 2003, she'd recovered enough that her true self started to resurface, breaking through the protective walls her psyche had built. Or maybe something specific had happened, some trigger, some event that had shocked her back into awareness, but without her memories, they would never know what that trigger might have been. 3 years after returning from Tokyo, Eleanor had built what looked like a normal life from the outside. She'd moved into her own small apartment, though it was only a few blocks from Margaret's house. She'd enrolled in some art classes at a community college. She had acquaintances, if not close friends. She could function day to day without falling apart. But there was always a shadow over everything, the knowledge that 5 years of her life were simply gone, inaccessible, lost to whatever her mind had done to protect itself. The paintings continued. Eleanor's apartment was filled with them, dozens of canvases depicting scenes and places and moments she couldn't consciously remember, but that clearly existed somewhere in her subconscious. Dr. Chen had suggested Eleanor consider having an exhibition, a way to share her story and process her trauma publicly. Eleanor was initially resistant to the idea. The paintings felt too personal, too raw, but eventually, she agreed to a small show at a local gallery, with the proceeds going to organizations that help families of missing persons. The exhibition was called 5 Years, and it opened on a cool evening in October. Margaret was there, of course, along with Dr. Chen and a few of Eleanor's co-workers and classmates. The gallery wasn't large, but it was filled with people curious about this woman's story, this mystery that had never been fully solved. The paintings were displayed chronologically based on when Eleanor had created them, starting with the dark, chaotic pieces from her first months back in Seattle, and progressing through to her more recent work, which was still abstract but showed hints of light breaking through the shadows. One painting in particular drew a lot of attention. It was one of Eleanor's most recent pieces, and it showed a figure clearly Eleanor herself standing at a crossroads. Behind her was darkness, a swirling void of blacks and grays. In front of her were multiple paths, each rendered in different colors, stretching toward a horizon that glowed with soft light. A journalist from a local paper interviewed Eleanor about the exhibition, asking the questions everyone always asked. Did she think she'd ever remember what happened to her? Did she have any theories about those missing years? What was it like to live with such a significant gap in her life story? Eleanor gave the answers she'd learned to give, thoughtful, honest, but maintaining boundaries she needed for her own mental health. She talked about the importance of living in the present rather than being consumed by an inaccessible past. She spoke about how trauma affected memory, and how sometimes the mind protected itself in ways that seemed cruel but might actually be necessary for survival. I used to think that recovering my memories was the only way I could truly heal, Eleanor told the journalist. But I've come to realize that healing doesn't require remembering. It requires accepting. Accepting that some things might always be unknown, and finding a way to build a meaningful life despite that uncertainty. The article that resulted from the interview was thoughtful and compassionate, focusing not just on the sensational aspects of Eleanor's disappearance, but on the deeper questions about identity, memory, and trauma. It was picked up by several larger publications, and suddenly Eleanor's story was circulating again, reaching a wider audience. And that's when something unexpected happened. Something that would finally provide at least a partial answer to the mystery that had haunted Eleanor and her family for so many years. A woman in California read the article about Eleanor's exhibition. Her name was Dr. Patricia Winters, and she was a neurologist who specialized in rare memory disorders. She'd been researching a phenomenon she called dissociative migration cases, where people experiencing severe psychological distress essentially created new lives for themselves, abandoning their previous identities without any conscious awareness of doing so. Dr. Winters had documented several cases over her career, though they were extremely rare. The pattern was always similar: a triggering event, usually traumatic, followed by the person essentially becoming a different version of themselves, often in a different location, living a simplified life disconnected from their previous identity. Eleanor's case fit the pattern almost perfectly. Dr. Winters reached out to Dr. Chen, offering to consult on Eleanor's case and share her research. What Dr. Winters explained was that Eleanor had likely experienced what she termed a protective dissociative state, triggered by a traumatic event on the day she disappeared in Asakusa. During this state, Eleanor's conscious connection to her identity as Eleanor Davis from Seattle had been severed. She'd essentially become a different person, not through a deliberate choice, but through an unconscious psychological mechanism designed to protect her from overwhelming trauma. This new version of Eleanor had existed in a kind of liminal space, able to perform basic survival functions but disconnected from any sense of past or future. She drifted through Tokyo for years, her mind essentially in neutral, going through motions without conscious thought or intention. The recovery process, Eleanor's sudden reappearance in Shibuya in 2003, was likely the result of this protective state gradually weakening over time. As Eleanor's unconscious mind determined that enough time had passed, that whatever had triggered the dissociation was no longer an immediate threat, it began allowing her true identity to resurface. But here's where Dr. Winters' research revealed something crucial in most of her documented cases. The original trauma that triggered the dissociative state wasn't actually as severe as the psychological response to it might suggest. Often it was something that, to an outside observer, might not seem particularly traumatic at all. The key factor wasn't the objective severity of the event, but rather how the individual's specific psychological makeup and circumstances led them to perceive and process that event. Someone already dealing with depression, anxiety, or other mental health challenges might have a much more severe reaction to a stressor than someone in a healthier mental state. Dr. Winters asked to review all of Eleanor's medical and psychological records from before her disappearance. With Eleanor's permission, Dr. Chen provided them. What Dr. Winters found was telling. In the months before Eleanor's trip to Tokyo, she'd been dealing with several significant stressors. She'd broken up with a long-term boyfriend. She'd been struggling with the pressure of deciding on graduate schools and career paths. She'd been having conflicts with friends about different life directions. Nothing catastrophic, just the normal stresses of being a young adult at a transitional life stage. But Eleanor's journal entries from that time, which Margaret had saved, revealed someone who was more fragile than she'd let on, more overwhelmed by the weight of decisions and uncertainties. The trip to Tokyo was supposed to be an escape, a chance to clear her head and gain perspective before making major life decisions. But Dr. Winters theorized that instead of providing relief, being alone in a foreign country might have actually intensified Eleanor's underlying anxiety and sense of being overwhelmed. "I believe something happened that day in Asakusa," Dr. Winters explained during a consultation with Eleanor, Margaret, and Dr. Chen. "Probably something small, something that wouldn't seem significant to most people. But in Eleanor's vulnerable mental state at that time, it was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back." "Like what?" Eleanor asked. "What could have happened that would cause me to just disappear into myself for 5 years?" Dr. Winters hesitated. "Without your memories, I can only speculate. But in similar cases I've studied, the trigger was often something like a moment of intense panic in a crowded place, or a sudden overwhelming feeling of being lost and alone, or even just a cascading series of small stresses that accumulated into a breaking point." She explained that in that moment of psychological crisis, Eleanor's mind had essentially said, "I can't handle this anymore," and had shut down her connection to the identity and life that was causing her so much stress. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was an automatic protective response, like how the body goes into shock after severe physical trauma. "So I spent 5 years as..." "What exactly?" Eleanor asked. "Someone else? No one at all?" "A simplified version of yourself," Dr. Winters suggested. "One that didn't have to make decisions or face uncertainties or deal with all the pressures that had been building up. Your unconscious mind created a kind of safe holding space where you could exist without being overwhelmed." It wasn't a complete answer. It didn't explain every detail of those missing 5 years. But it was a framework that made sense. A way to understand what had happened that aligned with the fragmented evidence they had. Eleanor sat with this information for a long time, processing it. Part of her felt almost disappointed after all this time. All this searching. The answer wasn't some dramatic kidnapping or mysterious conspiracy. It was just her own mind, overwhelmed and trying to protect itself in the only way it knew how. But there was also a strange sense of relief, because if Dr. Winters was right, then Eleanor hadn't been a victim of someone else's cruelty. She'd been a victim of her own psychological vulnerability, which was somehow less terrifying than the alternatives she'd imagined. "Will I ever remember what happened that day in Asakusa?" Eleanor asked. "The thing that triggered all of this?" Dr. Winters couldn't make promises. "Maybe someday," she said. "The mind has a way of revealing things when it's ready. But it's also possible that those memories are gone permanently, and you'll have to make peace with never knowing exactly what happened in that market." Eleanor thought about this, about the years she'd spent desperately trying to recover those lost memories, and she realized that maybe she'd been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe the question wasn't, "What happened to me?" Maybe the real question was, "Who am I now, and how do I want to move forward?" Because the truth was, those 5 years had happened. Eleanor had lived them, even if she couldn't remember them. They'd shaped who she was, left marks on her psyche that would never fully fade. But they didn't have to define her entire life. She could choose to build something new from where she was now. She could choose to focus on the memories she could create rather than the ones she'd lost. It's been more than 2 decades now since Eleanor Davis vanished in that Tokyo market, and more than 20 years since she reappeared, confused and disoriented, in Shibuya. She's 46 years old now, and those missing 5 years have become just one chapter in a much longer story. The memories never fully returned. Every now and then, Eleanor gets flashes, a smell that triggers something, a sound that feels familiar, a dream that might be a memory or might just be her mind's attempt to fill in the blanks. But the coherent narrative of those years remains locked away, and Eleanor has finally made peace with that. She became an art therapist, using her own experience with expressing trauma through painting to help others work through their own psychological struggles. She specializes in working with people who've experienced dissociative episodes or memory loss, understanding in a deep, personal way what they're going through. Her relationship with her mother deepened through the years. They're closer now than they were before the disappearance, bound together by shared trauma but also by the daily choice to appreciate the time they have rather than mourn the time they lost. Eleanor never went back to Tokyo. The thought of it still triggers anxiety she's not ready to face. But she's traveled to other places cautiously at first, always with someone she trusts, always with a detailed plan and regular check-ins. She's learned that she can't let fear of what happened prevent her from living her life. She's in a relationship now, with someone who knows her whole story and loves her not despite it but including it. Someone who understands that there's a part of Eleanor's history she can't share because she doesn't have access to it herself. The case in Tokyo was never officially closed, but it's no longer actively investigated. Detective Yamamoto retired years ago, though he still occasionally sends Margaret an email, checking in, letting her know he hasn't forgotten. He considers Eleanor's case one of the great unsolved mysteries of his career, though he's glad at least that this one had a mostly happy ending. Dr. Winters published a paper about Eleanor's case with Eleanor's permission and with identifying details contributing to the small but growing body of research on dissociative migration. She hopes that sharing these rare cases will help other medical professionals recognize the symptoms and understand how to better help people experiencing these kinds of psychological crises. Eleanor's art exhibition evolved into a traveling show that raises awareness about missing persons and the psychological impacts of trauma. She gives occasional talks about her experience, not focusing on the sensational aspects of the disappearance, but rather on the themes of resilience, acceptance, and finding ways to move forward when the past remains uncertain. She still paints, of course, always will. It's become her way of processing not just the trauma of those missing years, but all of life's complexities and uncertainties. Her style has evolved over the years, becoming brighter, more hopeful, though there are still shadows in the corners of her canvases. One of her recent paintings hangs in Margaret's living room. It shows a path through a forest, with light filtering down through the trees. You can't see where the path leads, it curves out of sight around a bend, but the quality of the light suggests that wherever it goes, there's beauty waiting there. That's become Eleanor's philosophy. You don't always need to see where the path leads to be willing to walk it. Sometimes you just have to trust that each step forward is taking you somewhere, even if you can't quite see the destination. On the anniversary of her disappearance, October 13th, Eleanor has developed a ritual. She takes that day to reflect on everything that's happened, everything she's lost and everything she's gained. She writes a letter to her younger self, the 23-year-old who stepped into that Tokyo market with a camera and dreams, having no idea what was about to happen. In these letters, she tells her younger self that it's going to be okay. Not easy, not simple, not the way anyone would have planned it, but okay. She tells her that she's going to lose something precious, 5 years she'll never get back, but she's going to find something too. Strength she didn't know she had. Understanding she couldn't have gained any other way. A appreciation for memory itself, for the gift of being present in your own life. And she always ends these letters the same way. You're going to survive this, and someday, you're going to help others survive their own impossible things. The path ahead is strange and difficult, but I promise you, it's worth walking. Eleanor keeps all these letters in a box, never sends them anywhere, of course, but writing them helps her maintain connection between all the different versions of herself, the bright young woman she was before, the lost soul she became during those missing years, and the resilient survivor she is now. Because that's what Eleanor has learned. We're all made up of different versions of ourselves across time. Some of those versions we remember clearly, some we don't. But they all contribute to who we are in this moment. In this present, that's all we ever really have. So what can we learn from Eleanor Davis's story? What lessons can we take from this mysterious disappearance and improbable return? Let me share with you 5 crucial insights, starting with the most important and working backward through what this case can teach all of us. The 5th lesson is about digital privacy and staying connected. Eleanor disappeared in 1997, before smartphones and constant connectivity were the norm. Today, we have technology that can help keep us safe: location sharing, regular check-ins, GPS tracking. If you're traveling, especially alone, use these tools. Let people know where you are. Create a routine of regular contact that, if broken, will immediately alert someone that something is wrong. But also protect your digital privacy. Don't broadcast your location publicly. Don't share your travel plans with strangers online. Use technology as a safety net with people you trust, not as a public announcement to everyone who might see it. The 4th lesson is about recognizing when you or someone you love is struggling mentally. Eleanor's case shows us that psychological crises don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, building up over time until something triggers a breakdown. If you notice someone withdrawing, becoming increasingly anxious or overwhelmed, expressing feelings of being unable to cope, take it seriously. Encourage them to seek help. Mental health crises are just as real and potentially dangerous as physical health emergencies, and they deserve the same level of attention and care. The 3rd lesson is about awareness of your surroundings. When you're traveling, especially in unfamiliar places, stay alert. Crowded areas might feel safe because there are so many people around, but that same crowd can make it easy to become disoriented or separated from your group. Have a meeting point established in case you get separated. Keep important documents secure. Stay sober enough to make good decisions. And trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Remove yourself from the situation. The 2nd lesson is about immediate action when someone goes missing. Eleanor's friends waited 2 hours before becoming truly concerned, and even then it took time to file a report. We now know that the first hours after someone goes missing are crucial. Don't wait if someone fails to show up when they're supposed to, especially if it's out of character. Contact local authorities immediately. Start documenting everything: last known location, what they were wearing, who they were with, any plans they'd mentioned. The faster the response, the better the chances of finding someone quickly and safely. And the 1st, most important lesson: the power of hope and family support during crisis. Margaret Davis spent 5 years not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. 5 years of uncertainty and grief and desperate searching. But she never gave up. And when Eleanor was finally found, when she needed support to rebuild her shattered life, Margaret was there. This is what carried Eleanor through her recovery: the knowledge that no matter how lost she'd been, someone had been looking for her. Someone had been waiting for her return. If you have someone in your life who's going through a crisis, whether it's a disappearance, a mental health struggle, an addiction, or any other kind of trauma, your presence matters. Your consistency matters. Your refusal to give up on them matters. Even when they're too lost to know you're there, keep being there. Keep showing up. Keep holding space for their eventual return to themselves. Because people can come back from impossible places. Eleanor did. She lost 5 years of her life to circumstances we still don't fully understand, and she came back. Not unchanged. You can't go through something like that without being fundamentally altered. But she came back and built a life worth living. That's the real lesson here. Not that we can prevent every tragedy or solve every mystery, but that we can survive even the most incomprehensible experiences. We can find our way back from being lost. We can build meaning from confusion and create beauty from pain. Eleanor's 5 missing years will likely remain a mystery, but the 20 years since her return, those have been hers, fully lived and remembered, filled with purpose and connection and growth. The time she lost doesn't have to define her entire story. And whatever you're facing in your own life, whatever uncertainty you're living with, whatever trauma you're processing, whatever mystery you're trying to solve, you can write the next chapter yourself. You can decide that your story doesn't end with what was lost, but begins with what you choose to do with what remains. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened to Eleanor during those 5 years in Tokyo? Do you believe Dr. Winter's theory about dissociative migration? Or do you think there's more to the story that we haven't uncovered? Have you or someone you know experienced memory loss or a dissociative episode? How did you cope with the uncertainty of not knowing your own story? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read every single one and I reply to as many as I can. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you think her message of resilience and hope needs to be heard by more people, then please share this video. Share it with someone who's struggling with trauma or uncertainty. Share it with someone who has a loved one who's missing. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that people can survive impossible things and build meaningful lives on the other side. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that don't just focus on the mystery but on the human beings at the center of these cases, on their struggles and their strength and their survival, then subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We're building a community here of people who believe that every person's story matters, that every case deserves to be remembered with compassion and respect. This case reminds us of how fragile our sense of self can be, how much we rely on memory to anchor us in our own lives. It reminds us to appreciate the gift of being present, of knowing who we are and where we've been. It reminds us to be patient and compassionate with those who are lost, whether physically or psychologically, because the journey back isn't always straightforward and it isn't always fast. Eleanor Davis spent 5 years lost in ways we may never fully understand. But she found her way back. She's living proof that even when the path disappears completely, even when you have no idea where you are or how you got there, it's possible to find your way home. Hold on to that truth. And if you're feeling lost right now in your own life, know that the path doesn't disappear forever. Sometimes you just can't see it because you're standing in the wrong place. Sometimes you need help from others to find it again. Sometimes you need to accept that you might never understand how you ended up where you are. And that's okay. What matters is where you choose to go from here. Thank you for watching Eleanor's story with me. Thank you for holding space for her experience, for resisting the urge to sensationalize or simplify, for sitting with the uncertainty and the complexity. I'll see you in the next video with another story that deserves to be told. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Remember to check in with the people you love. Remember that your presence in someone's life might be the thing that guides them home. And remember, you're more resilient than you know, more capable of surviving the impossible than you think. Eleanor's story proves that.